So you're joining me on this cycle as I leave the place I camped overnight by the canal and head to join the Midland Great Western Railway as it heads down from Mullingar to Athlone, a distance of about 42 kilometres. This is one of a growing number of old rail trail cycling routes in Ireland, and they're particularly suitable for nervous cyclists or people cycling with young children because there's pretty much no traffic on them except where they cross road junctions, and generally they're fairly well protected at that point. So it's 10 to 7. I've just didn't sleep well last night for whatever reason, so I'm up on the road early, or rather on the rail trail early, and heading to Athlone. And I may make it all the way to Galway City today. In fact, we shall see. But the rail trail has I'd noticed there was a wide green strip on the right hand side that I thought, I can probably camp on that, but actually it's the rail lines, like the actual lines, so that'd be very uncomfortable. But I will note any spots as I go down. While you may well be looking at this route to do a short section of it in a few hours, I was on a 2-day mission to discover the missing EuroVelo2 route that's meant to run from Dublin to Galway but has got stuck at the planning process for years. But this is the logical route it will follow, and indeed the rail trail says it will be along this route. And so this is day 2. I've woken up after camping just outside Mullingar. I'd cycled up the Royal Canal from Dublin, so it's been almost entirely off-road, and it will continue to be until I get to Athlone. And then if you stay with me for after Athlone, I'll be showing you some of the back road networks that I think you can get to Galway on. Because the old rail lines are still in place, you couldn't really camp on most of the length of this. That looks green on a satellite view, but it would be very uncomfortable. However, there is this spot here where there's a stream crossing it, and they seem to have removed the rails just where the bridge is. So there's a little patch of grass there and on the other side. So that might do you. So while I'm covering the various greenways as part of this channel, what I'm mostly about is e-bike touring, and that involves travelling over many days, over quite large distances, seeking where you can off-road places like this, but also one of the things you often want to look for is places to camp. A lot of people who are doing this are either doing it on a budget or you're doing it quite spontaneously, so you're kind of seeing how far you can cycle each day and then picking somewhere to stay overnight. So both the canals and the rail trails often enough will have spots where it's possible to wild camp as you're making your way along. What that essentially means is you just set up a tent where there's space late in the evening, and then you go very early in the morning and you make sure you clean everything up after yourself, so your presence should really be pretty much invisible to anybody who's coming past later on. They have done a particularly good job with this greenway, I think, in terms of leaving some of the historical bits in place, the signage that explains where you are at different points. You'll see me regularly stop and then post a photograph of those here. And at intervals, they've converted the old railway stations into rest stops. There's picnic areas, there's cafes, there's a toilet at this particular one as well. There's a space out the back where there were camper vans, and you could probably put a tent up there for the night as well, I'd say. And yeah, it's really a great resource. So it's both a good resource, I think, for people who live on the route and want to, say, walk their dogs in the morning or go for a cycle or a jog as an exercise. But it's also a good resort for bringing tourists into an area, including cycle tourists, and giving them a safe route to get from Mullingar all the way down to Athlone, and with facilities along the way. As I said, I was really pretty impressed with this. There is a legitimate concern over rail greenways that these rail lines should actually be brought back into use as passenger or at least freight service. However, the cost of creating a greenway for cyclists and walkers out of a rail line is probably measured in the low millions. The cost of bringing back a rail route is going to be in the hundreds of millions, and you're going to be talking about a process that takes many years. And one of the problems is if a rail route is simply left abandoned, it's often the case that sections of the land get taken in by other people, kind of a squatter's rights. I've even come across a house in the middle of what was an old rail section in one part of Ireland. So at least if you have this sort of greenway set down, then not only are you getting the benefit of tourism and recreational local use while the greenway's in place, but it's also preserved the line. So it's pretty easy, you can imagine, to come back here and to simply relay the rail line on top of this. There isn't really any need to go through compulsory purchase orders or other problem issues. The Old Rail Trail very literally runs through the middle of Ireland. In fact, the exact centre is a little bit south of it in a farmer's field. There's nothing much to see there, so it's not worth visiting, but it's actually marked on Google Maps if you look it up. But perhaps much more significantly, the old ceremonial centre of the island is found at Uisneach, which is a little bit north. In fact, the ancients were only a little bit out in their estimate of where the centre of the island was, which is quite impressive. That's also a working farm, so it's not somewhere you can casually rock up to. However, because it's such an important centre, they do regularly have events there, and particularly to mark the key dates of the solar calendar, and particularly Bealtaine in May. That's on May Day, when there's fires lit on top, and they have a really big sort of elaborate ceremony as part of it. So far, it's not something I've actually managed to visit. As regular followers to the channel will know, I've quite an interest in kind of prehistory, so it certainly will be in the future. And the archaeological evidence of the Hill of Uisneach does make it look like it was in use going way back to the Neolithic, then into the Bronze Age, and even into the modern period, where Daniel O'Connell, for instance, had mass rallies there, and also De Valera did. So yeah, if you're cycling this route and looking for something to visit, Uisneach's well worth considering. Jumping into the modern period, the moat area is particularly interesting because it was sort of the headquarters when they were building the railway back in the 1840s, I think it was. They had about 9,000 people employed doing so, and it's also nice because the particular plaque mentions that the local volunteers involved in the Greenway were people who had links back to the railway itself, so probably the sons and daughters of people who'd been railway engineers and station keepers and signalmen and all that sort of thing. The railways in that respect are a bit like the canals in that they're also a visit through the older Irish industrial and indeed agricultural landscape. Hey, Ossie. The Midland Great Western Railway was about the third biggest of the Irish railroads, about 900 kilometres of track altogether. And linked Dublin with both Galway and Sligo. But obviously this Athlone to Mullingar branch was also extremely significant, and in fact one of the most successful branch lines. This branch lasted about 130 years or so. Castletown Station opened in 1851, and the line closed down in 1987. The reason the line closed was, as in other places, that roads and freight lorries on roads had replaced what had been a large proportion of the rail traffic. So basically the rail line was then lying unused for about 4 decades until funding was allocated in the 2010s, and then the first section opened around 2015. Now, I've seen a figure for a cost of 7 million. I'm not altogether sure if that's for the entire 42 kilometre length though, or just the initial section as far as Moat. But certainly it was expected it would also give an economic boost to the area. And then later on, of course, they've built a cyclist and footbridge in Athlone that connects directly to the end, and we'll see that as I get down towards the end and we swing from one over to the other. So that's quite useful because one of the problems of long distance cycling is there's always a pinch point when you get to a big river, because there's relatively few bridges and lots of roads converging, and so it always feels a little bit dangerous and tricky once you get down to those big bridges over big rivers basically. So it's nice when you get down here to have the footbridge. So now on this I'm getting into the outskirts of Athlone. So here it's interesting because there are a lot of people obviously just using it to walk in and out of the town. There's now much more cyclists on it. I'd seen very very few people up to that point, and of course your few dog walkers, and then around to where it sort of ends at an abbey, although as you'll see when I continue it on around the corner here in a couple of minutes, I do then get to the River Shannon and get to cross over the footbridge, which is where those of you just interested in the rail trail probably want to end this journey. The cycle tours and intending cycle tours, however, might want to stay with me for another couple of minutes as we cross the bridge into Athlone and I go in search of not just one, but in fact 2 breakfasts. I had just cycled 42 kilometres on nothing but a Snickers bar, so I needed these, and then proceeded to find my way out of the town. So the challenge here is there is no EuroVelo route from Athlone to Galway. So I use in these situations a website called cycle.travel, and what it does is it basically plots you along secondary and tertiary roads, particularly tertiary roads. In Ireland, tertiary roads are given the designation L for local, easy enough to remember, and it's very good at finding a network of them and joining up. In fact, look at this this road coming out of Athlone, which has a barrier in the middle, so can only really be used to access fields, and that gets you by the worst of the traffic emerging from the town itself. Now, the network can't be perfect, as here there are little bits where it's going to stick you on the side of a national road or on a local road, so it's nothing like Greenway cycling. However, it doesn't do a bad job at all, it has to be said, and I'm quite quickly on roads where, as you can see, there's very little traffic indeed. You know, this is exactly the sort of cycling I actually love, where you're going through the countryside, seeing what's happening around, and then randomly coming across sites and places of interest. Like this ruined abbey here, for instance, that I stopped for a few minutes at. I will add a link to my cycle travel route map in the video description, so if you click that open you'll be able to go to an actual copy, an exact copy in fact, of the route I followed. I do that with almost all my videos. It's always worth reading the description, there's extra information there. But yeah, as you can see, we're very rapidly on very L local roads, the ones that have green mohawk growing down the centre. Always a little bit worried when you hit these they're going to hit a dead end, but that hardly ever happens. Has happened once or twice where it's become impassable. But certainly if anybody is familiar with the main road running through this region from Athlone to Galway, this is very, very much more preferable and pleasant cycling. Don't cycle that road, it's terrible. So yeah, coming through the countryside, we're now coming around north of Ballinasloe, if you're familiar with that, and basically we're kind of swinging a loopy arc that goes north and then a little bit south and then north again, so it is longer than the direct route, but not to the extent that it's worth basically risking the busier roads. This again being a regional road. Regional roads generally are running between smaller towns, and then the national roads, the third category, are running between major towns and cities. They're the ones you really want to avoid at all costs, because they'll be full of traffic doing 100 to 120 kilometres an hour, and they don't often even have a hard shoulder. The one hazard you do have with the agricultural roads is that you often run into farm machinery, and that lorry just there for instance, but everybody's going fairly slowly, so if you keep your wits about you and particularly your ears, you'll hear those big trucks and the tractors coming from quite some distance away. Now, a confession to make, I was being overly ambitious in the idea that I was going to get to Galway on the second day, and I failed. I was in fact heading towards eventually towards friends of mine who were near Loch Ray, which is about 40 kilometres back east from Galway, so my original intention was to go all the way to Galway and then 40 kilometres back. I realised I was a little bit too tired. I hadn't slept very well, so I wasn't going to manage this. So in fact, I didn't complete the entire route to Galway. I made it about 40 to 50 kilometres out of Athlone. However, having looked at the cycle travel map and the sort of roads it's following, I'm pretty confident that basically what you're seeing here would be very typical of what the rest of the route would look like. So if you're concerned about doing that cycle to Galway, I'd be fairly reassured. The roads near Galway themselves do tend to be very busy. However, you'll pick up EuroVelo2 on the outskirts of
Moore, and that will take you into Galway itself. Not ideal. Galway is possibly the worst city in Ireland for cycling. They've a very weird situation where the local council is obsessed with building a ring road, and central government is saying we won't fund it because you're meant to be building active travel out, and there's just back and forth going on over that for ages. But anyway, I've taken you this far. This certainly looks like a fairly good, quiet route. A little bit busy in parts. Partially that's to do with the time of the day you're cycling at it as well. But certainly I think a safer route that will get you from Dublin to Galway probably won't be found until they finally get their act together and complete a proper EuroVelo2 route. The route from Athlone to Galway, by the way, will be very long. They're basically building a tourist route that will loop down along the Shannon. I suspect it probably will be quite beautiful, but it will be fairly indirect. So it could be that actually this route we're seeing here, if you're in a hurry to get to the west coast, will be the one you'd find. And here's me trying to get some last energy for the last 30-kilometre cycle where I had some wine. So that completes the second day of that 2-day trip. If you haven't already watched the first day, which is Dublin to Mullingar, do have a look. It's well worth looking at the Royal Canal and considering that as a route. I'm doing a lot of cycle travelling videos on this channel. About 2/3 of them are these sort of day diaries, route descriptions, and about a third are kind of how-to. And the how-tos are particularly focused on travelling by electric bike. So if those are of interest to you, please do subscribe. If you found this video interesting, do give it a big thumbs up. That helps me get it out to more people, build the audience and build the channel. If you're kind of interested in seeing what I'm doing right now, then follow my Instagram account. That's also called eBike Touring Life. Basically, YouTube videos take a while to edit, so I generally put them up in a week, a month, 2 months after I've actually done a trip. But while I'm doing a trip, I post live stories onto Instagram, and then at the end of each day, or maybe the following morning, I do the best photos I took that day and do a short text account of it, so you'll get a much more immediate sense of just what I'm up to at this particular moment. Finally, as I said, do read the video description, but also do use the comments to ask questions or make comments. Could well be you're much more familiar with this route than I am. You've suggestions of diversions on it, better roads to take, anything like that, or updates that have happened since. I do monitor them pretty well. I'll respond to anything that's anyway sensible whatsoever. If you're just trolling, I might ignore you. But if you're looking at this because you're thinking of taking up cycle touring or just doing longer cycles, well, I really hope it's encouraged you, and hopefully one day I shall meet you on the road.